Hi, I'm Jake, aka The Breakfast, with AYBOnline.com, and I'm here with E McNeill, who's developed Tactera and Darknet. So, what can you tell me about? Well, let's start with Darknet.
All right, Darknet is a cyberpunk hacking game for VR. So you play as a hacker in cyberspace as it was imagined by Hollywood in like 80s and 90s movies. So everything is like abstract, neon, glowing geometric shapes, and that represents data because you're inside the computer. The gameplay is kind of puzzle strategy gameplay. Um, you're trying to work your way through progressively higher levels of security, trying to reach, the root node within a time limit. So you're kind of racing against the clock, solving puzzles, strategizing at a higher level all the time, and trying to sort of increase your own skill as a hacker.
So that sounds pretty interesting. It's kind of like a hack the Gibson sort of. All right, well that's pretty cool. So I've actually had the chance to try the flavor demo. I haven't had the chance to try the full game yet. So what would you say are the key differences that have come about in the full version versus the flavor demo?
So the flavor demo is, it's so named because it doesn't really get deep into the gameplay. Um, so the full game, it starts you out into a tutorial that is sort of reminiscent of the flavor demo, but it's actually trying to like teach you stuff in a way that will stick with you. It gives you a lot of freedom. Like you can go and hack almost any node, but it's trying to give you sort of basic skills along the way, and so it's much more focused on like getting into the gameplay, and it's about 20-30 minutes for like the first level, and then beyond that the levels get bigger and bigger. However, your skill increases, and so actually the playtime gets smaller and smaller because you're like racing against harsher time limits as you increase in skill. So the flavor demo is almost like a playable trailer, as opposed to like a real game demo. And that's just an artifact of the fact that this is like a deep abstract puzzle game. It doesn't demo very well at a setting like PAX because we can't give half an hour to every player. The main game is the real game, and I feel like it holds up very well. I actually recently heard from Oculus that it is either number one or like in the running for the most played game in terms of average playtime, which is exactly what I was hoping to do with that game.
Yeah. Well, it's definitely one of the best games in terms of like motion sickness and in terms of presence. Even it's got a good sense of like it teaches you to look around in 360 degrees. So I think that's what makes it such a great Oculus show. Um, was there like an underlying narrative or story that you discover while you're hacking the computers that you can kind of tell us a little bit about?
Sure. So there is some narrative in the game. Darknet, I sort of had to wrestle with this a little bit because I tend to be a very mechanics-oriented designer. And so Darknet, in the end, is a very mechanics-oriented game. That's what it's ultimately about. But I realized, like, another big part of the appeal of this game is the setting and the feeling of, like, being a hacker in cyberspace, of sort of tapping into that fantasy of, like, the cyberpunk future. And so I felt like it did need, like, a narrative layer. And so the way that's incorporated to try to sort of balance those two things out is the narrative is kind of taking place in the background. You are sort of this mercenary hacker who's taking on contracts for bitcoins, of course, and every time you complete a hack, you get a little news story that explains what effect you had in the world. And so in the background, you are having these like effects of different sizes, some of them quite major on the world around you. Um, but it's not like a plot that's unfolding linearly. There are some threads that you can follow. You can sort of choose to favor like taking down governments or like the mega corporations or other hackers. But that's not like something that's very in your face. It's something that you would have to look for.
Okay, so you mentioned taking down corporations and taking down other hackers. Can you work together with them as well?
Not exactly. So in the game, everything is sort of anonymized for you as the player, and so you're sort of choosing what effect you're going to have on the world, but you're not interfacing directly with all of these other characters. Essentially, there are other hackers, and this is sort of a future in which you know behind the scenes things are destabilizing a bit because uh, kind of like the conceit is quantum computing has been figured out. Basic decryption is not as formidable as it used to be, and so hackers like you can do stuff that you weren't able to do before. And that's not really something that the corporations or governments want publicized because they want to maintain like some sort of confidence in everything. But that is what's happening, and so stories are getting out that weren't there before, or sort of digital bank heists are taking place, and you can choose what targets you're going to affect as a hacker. You get like a brief idea of like what your mission is before you start, but you're not. It's not like you can play as a clear good guy or bad guy. It's more that you're sort of exploring the effects that you have on this system, and you can pick sort of what you're going to prioritize, but it's hard to take a strong moral stand in this world.
When there are other hackers, is that some sort of like Dark Souls style drop in, drop out multiplayer? Is there some sort of plan for something like that?
I've considered different ways of trying to incorporate multiplayer. So it is not how it is right now, and I'm still sort of playing around with those ideas, but it's been difficult to figure out a good way to make it work because the core game, was built at the beginning around a solid, deep single-player experience. And I kind of liked that feeling of, sort of being solitary in the void of cyberspace. And, it's extending infinity in all directions and there's no one around. So, actually in the PC version of Darknet, which I've been working on recently, there are several expanded, features beyond the version that's available on the Gear VR right now. One of them is the introduction of these sort of enemy agents that exist inside a network with you. And honestly, I don't know exactly what they're going to be in the fiction of the game yet. It may be that those are sort of AI programs that are fighting against you. It could be that they are like defensive hackers that are sort of agents of, the network you're trying to... it's, essentially an entity that appears in the level and tries to undo the work that you're doing. You might hack something and they will travel through the network, undoing what you do and actually making the network stronger where they, counter your actions. And you have ways of fighting against that too, of like stopping them in their tracks. But it's difficult, and it kind of adds an interesting twist because you have to keep an eye on sort of where this enemy agent is in the network, what you can do to stop them or like lead them astray from the part that you're really trying to hack. And so, it's the biggest way in which the network is actively fighting against you, as opposed to being more of like a static puzzle that you're acting upon.
Okay, all right. Well, that sounds pretty interesting. So let's move on to Tactera. So what can you tell me about Tactera?
So Tactera is a tabletop real-time strategy game, which means you're in virtual reality in a room, sort of a futuristic command center, and you get a holographic tabletop in front of you that's like a miniature representation of a real-time battlefield. So you are seeing tiny, tanks rolling over the hills and bombers flying overhead and commanding the bases, sending out troops, etc. So it's effectively like a relatively simple real-time strategy or tactics game. But I really like the virtual tabletop perspective, in part because it feels really cool to like lean in and like see the objects like right there and like looking. Yeah, and when they're all moving around, that feels really cool. We're not used to tabletop games in which all of the objects are moving on their on their own volition. The other big advantage of the virtual tabletop perspective is it doesn't require artificial player movement or rotation. So that's like one of the biggest triggers for nausea. If everything's taking place in front of you, you can still get this really cool feeling of immersion in virtual reality without having to move around a large space. The only movement that's necessary is just what's being tracked by the camera, your actual movement in the world.
So I know that Tactera was made for the VR Jam, the mobile VR Jam. So what can you tell me about the specific challenges of working within that time frame and the specific challenges of working within the constraints of the Gear VR system specs?
Mm-hmm. So I'll take the second half of that first. Working for the Gear VR, I did that with Darknet, and so that actually I feel gave me some advantage of like understanding the limitations of the system. I still learned more stuff. There's a lot of unknown unknowns going into it, but I was able to like plan ahead for the limitations of the phone hardware, and so the game is designed with a relatively detailed room, but a lot of that is faked and it's actually quite low poly. And then the units in the game and like the table are they use a sort of abstract style, and all of the vehicles have this sort of low poly style, which I think is really stylish and works within that constraint. Actually, the artist who worked on them specializes in papercraft when he's not doing digital art, and so again, it was like a really nice fit, and I feel like that turned out very well. Um, in terms of working on within the time frame, like the mobile VR Jam time frame, I that is obviously a challenge, but for some reason, working under a deadline like that is the most sure way for me to like pump up my productivity. So, I have this problem. Like, if I have work expands to fill the time available for its completion. If I have a year, then it's like, oh well, I have forever from now. I can play Dota today or whatever. When I have, and it works on like an exponential, curve where at the beginning of the mobile VR Jam, I'm sort of like planning and like getting everything in order and like doing stress tests to get the performance right. Then it takes me, the next 2 weeks to get just like the basic features done, and then in the final week, I turn it all into a complete game, all at once, because, for some reason, that allows me to focus. So, limited time is a challenge, but it is also an asset from like a motivation perspective.
With the artist actually specializing in papercraft, did you ever do any physical prototypes, like actually on a real tabletop?
I did not. I made prototypes. I did a little bit with paper, and I did like a digital prototype of the gameplay, but I didn't do anything visually at that point. He may have. I never actually saw anything like that. He's actually working from Austria, and so were working remotely together. And I sort of described to him what I was looking for. I gave him some reference images of like, oh, here's like a cool futuristic fighter, like the Orca hovercraft from Command and Conquer, which was like a big influence on the game. And he was like, okay, well, how about this? And he shows me something perfect, So that was really fun. Like, I don't have a very visually oriented mind, and so it's great to be surprised with something amazing, that like I didn't even know that's what I wanted, and I had that experience with working on Darknet as well.
I can definitely say from watching the trailers of Tactera, I can definitely feel the Command and Conquer kind of aspect. The music especially is very reminiscent of the old school RTSs, and I think we're actually coming back to sort of a renaissance, especially with like Grey Goo, of that old style Command and Conquer style RTS. So are you going to be implementing any kind of multiplayer into Tactera?
Yes, that's the plan. I'm hoping to be able to do synchronous multiplayer for the very first time. I've never done it before. I know it's got a reputation for being very tricky and difficult. I'm trying to get help for the first time on programming. I've been the sole programmer on all my projects up until now, and now I'm hoping to double my team size, right? In a limited way, so that I can get help on multiplayer. Probably it's going to start out with a relatively simple, like head-to-head, one-on-one system, and we'll expand from there. It depends on sort of the player base we can get, because it's difficult, for short games with that are indie games that don't have hundreds of thousands of players. You want to make sure that you can support like ongoing multiplayer. One thing that we're looking forward to implementing, though, is having the other player appear across the table from you. And because we can track the head movements, we can have like the other player represented as like a headset or helmet or something, and you can watch them sort of looking around the battlefield, like leaning in or whatever, and actually feel like there is somebody across from you. And and for anyone who hasn't experienced it, like when you have that that kind of movement, like actual head movement implemented in the game, you can immediately tell that it's actually another person. It's actual motion tracking, as opposed to like animation.
Yeah, it doesn't matter what the shape is. It doesn't matter. Like, it can be a simple cube, and it's just the way that it kind of tilts and moves. You can tell that it's a human head, and that's really great. All right, so is there anything about Tactera or Darknet that I haven't asked about that you'd like to kind of tell everybody?
I guess I mentioned this briefly, but so Darknet is out on the Gear VR right now, but an expanded version is going to be coming to PC. A lot of those features are sort of things that unlock or appear randomly later in the game at higher difficulty levels. And so if you're already like an expert at Darknet, you will get to start seeing that stuff immediately. If you're new to Darknet, you'll still get the sort of proper, less overwhelming intro to the game. So I think that's sort of a nice way of meshing those. And what I can support on mobile, I will try to get on mobile, after that PC version is done. The PC version is, going to be able to take, better advantage of like the PC hardware as well. Tactera is a lot earlier in development. The demo that I have here today is pretty much the extent of the development that's done so far. But if you've played the demo, it had like 6 units available, but was promising like another 6 more. I definitely plan to have those in. Terrain inside the maps, a campaign mode for sort of more substantial single player, and a multiplayer mode. I think it's going to turn into a very solid game.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your interview. This has been absolutely great.
Thank you.
And once again, this is E McNeill about Tactera and Darknet. So thank you for watching. Have a great day.